Hey guys, welcome to another guide to D&D Worldbuilding. This one we'll be talking about races and classes and your representation of them in your world. Now I think it's something that's not spoken about much when someone is creating a character. Typically they will consider their backstory and background, such as what job their character had, but I think also their class and race has a big impact on their role playing. For instance, if your character is a dwarf, think about the way that those dwarfs will interact with that character in your world. Another aspect is if one of your players is a druid, do you have druid circles in your world? Does your druid player know any of those druid circles? And it could make possible ties and characters related to that character. The first thing to consider is the representation of races in your world. D&D has a lot of races, so you may not be able to think about doing all of them straight away, but typically a fantasy setting will have elves, orcs, dwarves, etc. So maybe just start with those. For instance, are elves a rare occurrence and seen as a mythical type of creature? So when your players see them, it will be a rare and memorable experience for them. Or for example, are humans very common and cover most of the continent, making it more of a dominating race compared to others? Another thing to consider is if a race is possibly almost extinct. For instance, let's say in your world, dwarves are considered a almost dying race, with hardly any of them left in the world. That means if your player plays a dwarf, they will have unique interactions with the world. Maybe NPCs will gawk at them and be surprised to see one. Another aspect this could have in your world is if dwarves are practically extinct, then maybe their ruins are left behind, filled with treasures for your players to go and explore. This can make for great storytelling narrative, as you could have players trying to strive to rebuild their kingdoms. Another thing to consider is the history between your different races, how they allied or enemies. For instance, in the typical D&D setting, orcs and elves hate one another due to their ancestry fighting for centuries. Another example could be that tieflings might be a hated race in your world, given that they have a devil ancestry and don't feel they can be trusted. A good way to start is to try to consider your oldest race and expand from there. Think about how that race influenced the other races as they came into being. For instance, was the elves the oldest race, and were they previously the conquerors of all the lands? But maybe when the humans were introduced, they took over, and now the elves have a bit of a bitterness against humans for taking away their dominance. Another thing to consider is the themes that your races may have. For example, elves typically live in great woodland cities and are considered these elegant, magical individuals. Maybe not in your world, they could be considered these steampunk inventors that subvert this expectation of being combined with nature. Another example could be that dwarves are typically seen as hearty warriors that live deep within the earth and work in large forges. Maybe in your world they are a nature-loving, peaceful race that exist within the woodlands. Now, not all of your races have to subvert expectation. They can fit these normal fantasies, but it could make your world more unique and memorable to your players if it is outside the normal. It can make for a great fun exercise in your world building to think about the differences that your world will have to a typical world. Maybe in your world, Dragonborn are made artificially and wizards created them themselves. That can make for anyone who is playing a Dragonborn or interacts with one, consider how that Dragonborn came to be and who the wizard is that they know. To show how I've used these tips in my own form of world building, I'll talk about the two most prominent races in a world I'm currently creating. These are the Golemkin and the Divineborn. Now these two races have a history of warring with one another, making them hate one another. Now if I was to ever run this for a D&D world setting or another tabletop world setting, if a player was to play one of these races, then I'd make sure they'd have interesting interactions with the other race. For example, if a player or all of the party were playing Divineborn and they were to encounter a Golemkin, perhaps that Golemkin would be hostile to them. If they were a merchant, maybe they would refuse to sell them anything. Or if they were in a tavern, maybe a bar fight would start simply because a Golemkin was enraged at the sight of seeing a Divineborn. Now you have to be careful with this form of thinking. Make sure you explain to your players this is how the world is, so they understand what they get themselves into. If they don't want to be this race that is hated by others, then maybe try to make sure that's something you don't actually have for your group. At the end of the day, this is meant to be a fun experience, and even though it's for great world building, it's only worth doing if it really improves the game. The other aspect to consider is the classes. When your players pick your class, that is not just what they can do, but also it's what they are. It's who they became. And that's how you got to consider when NPCs also have these classes. Does your world have druid circles that guard the land and act as its wardens? Does your world have bard colleges that perhaps maybe one of your player bards trained at and knows some of the students or teachers there? Another thing to consider when you consider wizards, sorcerers, warlocks is, are spellcasters rare? Is magic well known? Or in some cases, is certain magic outlawed? For a good example, necromancy might be considered an illegal form of magic, therefore meaning when a player casts a necromantic spell, that could make for some great repercussions later into the adventure, maybe even leading to them having to get arrested and break themselves out. All these factors can make your world feel more real, and it also gives more ties for your players with their choices, knowing that when they pick a class, when they decide to be a barbarian, that they could meet more barbarians of this savage tribe. Maybe that could be where they came from, or it could give them something to be linked to outside of their race and background. I hope this video was helpful, and if there's any more suggestions of what else you'd like me to discuss, please put them in the comments below. Thanks for watching.